1 minute later, 2 minutes later, 3 minutes later, 4 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, 15 minutes later, 20 minutes later, 30 minutes later, 45 minutes later, several minutes later, a bunch of minutes later, many minutes later, 1 hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later, 4 hours later, 5 hours later, 12 hours later, several hours later, a bunch of hours later, many hours later, 1 day later, 2 days later, 3 days later, 4 days later, 5 days later, several days later, a bunch of days later, many days later, 1 week later, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, several weeks later, a bunch of weeks later, many weeks later, 1 month later, several months later, a bunch of months later, many months later, 1 year later, several years later, a bunch of years later, many years later, 1 decade later, an eternity later.